Emotional abuse can be such an isolating experience. So people even feeling like their life, their body is not theirs anymore. My partner does all of these things to me. They say all these things to me about my body and about who I am and my reason for being here. So it's not even mine anymore, it's theirs.
What do you think about when you hear the term domestic violence? For most people, they will picture a person that has experienced physical abuse, someone who has bruises, cuts, or marks on their skin. Very few will think about people who have experienced emotional violence because it doesn't leave a mark. This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today we're speaking with
Dr. Danielle Graddick.
not only is Dr. Graddick a member of our board of trustees, she is a clinical and forensic psychologist.
I own a private practice here in Springfield, New Jersey. So I see a wide variety of clients ranging from adolescents to adults, most of who have sort of some kind of trauma background, and who have a history of depression, anxiety, or relationship difficulties.
In this episode, Dr. Graddick explains why words matter, what emotional abuse feels like, and how it can damage our sense of identity. Now, emotional abuse is defined as non-physical behaviors intended to exploit another person's vulnerabilities, insecurities, or character. Now, that's a very formal definition. So if you wouldn't mind, could you break that down a little bit and make it more in plain language?
Sure, sure. I may repeat some of those words, but I'll
Totally
break
fine.
but I'll break it down a little more. So I think one of the key first words that you said is pattern. So oftentimes when we talk about emotional abuse, it's important to recognize that some of the behaviors that we might talk about today may be present in your relationship. You yourself listening may engage in these behaviors. If they're a one-off, then I'm not excusing them and saying that they're healthy, but sometimes we're human beings and we're not our best selves. But the key is really pattern. So a consistent sort of showing of these behaviors really meant to diminish your self-esteem, meant to erode your self-confidence, and meant to gain power and control over someone else. So another way that hopefully might be helpful to break down is these kind of patterns can be seen in really, really obvious ways, or they could be sort of the insidious covert ways. So I think the overt ways include yelling, slamming doors, cursing you out, just being super critical. But the covert ways that are harder to detect, that might look like gaslighting, like manipulating you into thinking that your experience isn't really yours or things didn't really happen, even though in your mind they did. They could also look like withdrawing and being super silent when there's something that happened where you're asking someone to take accountability and asking for forgiveness, and that person just sort of retreats back.
Mhm.
So there are lots of ways to look at emotional abuse, but I like to break them down into the things that are sort of we a lot of times we see in the media as the more
Mhm.
obvious signs, and then the sort of slow creep covert signs.
Yeah. And what might some of those look like? You could undermine their self confidence, embarrass them. What are some other concrete examples of somebody doing that? Like you mentioned gaslighting. What exactly does that look like?
So again, if the emphasis is on gaining power and control and making someone feel like their experiences aren't theirs, then a good example of gaslighting is your partner may yell at you over not doing the dishes that night. And you might say, I actually did do them at 10 o'clock, but you were asleep by that time. And perhaps the partner that's choosing to use abuse might say, well, that's not true. And by the way, I never yelled at you about it. So I don't even know why we're in this argument.
Right.
So there are things that in your mind happen and ways that you may be trying to defend yourself where the person who's choosing to use abuse might make you feel like those experiences didn't happen. So
Mm.
again, it's kind of this way to minimize experience and make the other person feel like their reality is not theirs, which can feel really, really scary.
Yeah, denying someone of what they know to be true and making them second guess themselves. I think, it's interesting you spoke a little bit earlier about this really being a pattern, right? And so where is the line where it's a normal disagreement or a normal misunderstanding and then it crosses into this is abusive. This is happening.
Mhm.
It's a clear difference. What would
Mhm.
that look like?
That's a really great question. I think that the biggest way I'd respond to that is by checking in with your nervous system and paying attention to how you feel around your
Mhm.
partner or the person that's choosing to use the abuse.
Yeah.
So, if there are these sort of disagreements that get ugly, again, I'm not saying that that's appropriate or healthy, but you might typically feel like when I go to this person, they respect me, they listen to me, they're
Mhm.
able to take accountability, they apologize, they value me.
Right.
But if we're talking about a relationship where there's emotional abuse present, it truly does feel like you're sort of trapped in a relationship with someone that really doesn't value you, that doesn't respect you,
Mhm.
and someone where you might feel anxious. Maybe you don't feel cared about, and maybe you don't feel like I could bring up my pain to this person and I know they'll be able to hear me. Maybe you just stop arguing altogether because you know where the arguments lead.
Yeah.
So it's really checking in with yourself and how you feel,
Mhm.
and sort of paying attention to the frequency of these kinds of disagreements and events.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting insight because I feel, as you mentioned, some of these are so covert that it is hard to kind of place a label of that's definitely the emotional abuse I'm experiencing right now. So, if you
Exactly.
look into your body, what are some other ways that emotional abuse might feel like to you? What are kind of some of those symptoms of it in your body?
The biggest one I tend to hear a lot, is sort of gastrointestinal feelings. So perhaps someone just may feel like this, not sense of butterflies, but this sort of low level pain in their stomach or this queasiness or
Mhm.
nausea
Mhm.
that, obviously could be attributed to lots of things. But if it's in the context of you experiencing this abuse with your partner, that's a good way. Sometimes it could be just subtle shaking, and if you know that you're about to raise something that might upset your partner, you might begin to shake or sweat.
Mhm.
You might experience frequent headaches, or just other like digestion issues. But I find that most of the people who I've worked with who experience abuse report this sort of stomach and head pain and this sort of temperature fluctuation between being really hot and being really cold.
Yeah, and maybe it's also something that you can tell that you're not feeling these symptoms a lot of the times when the person isn't around, or like you get a skip of the heart or something when they come into the room or something like that, where it's a signal to your body that something's going on here where maybe you're not feeling safe. And I think that's really, you know, to listen to your body could communicate a lot, which
Okay.
kind of brings me to my point of why do you think it's harder for people to recognize that they're experiencing emotional abuse? What makes it so difficult to put a finger on that?
There are a few things I think about. I think one is sometimes the people who are experiencing abuse have really difficult childhoods where they have what we call attachment disruption. So that means
Mm,
that their relationship with their early caregivers was disrupted, not healthy. Perhaps they have experienced abuse or neglect in their childhood. So
mm,
oftentimes people who have a history of these attachment disruptions then get into relationships that feel familiar and
mm.
feel familiar and painful in a way that reminded them of their past. So that's one way that I think it makes it hard to detect.
Yeah.
I also think that sometimes people who choose to use abuse are really great at masking it as care and concern. It might look like, babe, I really would prefer if you wear the other thing. Like, I don't really want you to wear that. I worry about your safety. Or
Mm,
it could be like, babe, I just really want to preserve your health, and I would prefer if you not eat that cookie right now. And I'd prefer you actually eat a salad instead. And again, like as
mm.
a one-off or as a partner that truly might care about your health based on your own health history, that might be an appropriate comment, but it looks like you're trying to erode my self-esteem. You're trying to pick me apart and you're trying to control me. So it just sort of is insidious in that way.
I think this speaks to something how to express also concern for your partner without it being controlling. You mentioned, hey, maybe you're diabetic, you've had a lot of sugar today, maybe this cookie isn't a great idea right now. You don't want to spike
Right.
your sugar. But how do you kind of figure out the distinction between if somebody is expressing a genuine care for you and when they're starting to exert control over your behaviors?
Mhm. So I think that it might look like paying attention to tone and language. So
Mm,
if your partner is saying it in a way where you can tell there's a genuine care, using
Yeah.
language that would make you feel more comfortable.
Mm.
Um, and if you know your partner has been concerned about your health, then that could also make it feel like, oh, maybe they're just trying to help me.
Right.
But if this partner says it in a nasty tone, or says it in times where it's really not appropriate, or
Right.
says it with the intention of making you feel bad, or
Mm.
with the intention of shutting you up or gaining control over you, that's when it starts to wade into emotional abuse territory.
Right.
It can be really, really hard for people to know the difference.
Yeah, and I also think if it's weaponized in a sense of like you can bring it up to someone like, "Hey, I noticed you were eating a lot of sugar," going back to the diabetic situation. How are you feeling? I just want to make sure you're safe versus somebody's just sitting on the couch and you're trying to be like, "You're going to have that cookie," and trying
Mhm.
to shame them instead of having that genuine, honest conversation. But I think that does make it so difficult because a lot of times abuse is masked in, oh, I'm just concerned for you, though. I just think you should work
Mhm.
out. I just think
Mhm.
you shouldn't go out with these guys because I don't trust men. And that's a
Exactly.
slippery slope.
Yeah.
Um, I also think physical abuse is so much more visible. It's very
Mhm.
clear that this is happening. You can kind of look at some bruising or something on your body and be like, this is happening to me. But when
Mhm.
it's emotional abuse, it's not quite as clear. And so I'm
Mhm.
wondering, what would you say to someone who doesn't think that they're experiencing real abuse because it's not physical?
Mm. Oh, that's such a great question. I think the first thing I would say is, you're not alone. There are a lot of people. I think that this specifically emotional abuse can be such an isolating experience.
Yes.
So the first thing I'd say is you're not alone, and there is support that's available to you and accessible for you. And there's people that care about you and want to support you through the experience. And unfortunately, there's also people who experience this a lot more than we'd like to see. So just the overall message being, you're not alone in this, and there is help that's available to you when you're able and choose to seek it. I think the other thing I'd say is, again, like going back to the nervous system thing, pay attention to how you feel, and
Mm.
pay, and also like know what's been your history of relationships, even going back to childhood. What's your relationship with your parents? How did they make you feel? Is your partner reminding you of dynamics that would happen with your parents that truly make you feel bad about yourself? So trying to kind of gain a little bit of insight and awareness into some of the patterns, I think, can be really helpful. And I think the other thing I'd say is, have a bit of compassion for yourself. You got into this relationship, I'm sure, for good reasons. There are a lot of reasons why it might be hard to leave these kinds of relationships, and there can be grace and compassion in your decision to be figuring it out, even your decision to sort of choose that partner. So even while you're listening to this, I hope that there's a bit of compassion and sort of empathy for you while you experience this and while you're figuring it all out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of self-blame too of getting into a relationship like this, like especially if it's something that happened when you were a kid and you saw, oh, I don't want this to be my relationship, and all of a sudden you are in this relationship again. How do you could you give an explanation as to why do people kind of replicate these relationships in childhood, even if they are noticing, I didn't like how this made me feel. This made me feel bad. What is it that kind of drives someone to then have those relationships in adulthood?
I think the biggest answer to that is their sense of self-worth. So
Mm.
if we feel, and it may not even be a conscious thing, it might be a sort of this unconscious underlying feeling at the root of you. But if you feel, and if you've been made to feel like you don't deserve better, that
Mhm.
this is the best that you're ever going to get, maybe, you didn't finish college and your partner shames you for that, or maybe you don't have the kind of body that your partner wants you to get. You might feel like you don't deserve anything more than what you're getting, and your early childhood caregivers may have made you feel that way too. So again, these might be familiar feelings.
Mhm.
So I really just sort of understanding that it's not helpful to you. It's not in service of you to blame you for getting into this relationship. It's just about gaining more awareness into why you might feel like this and why these feel familiar, and working on that sense of self-worth so that you feel like there can be better for you, and you feel like you deserve to be in a healthy relationship.
Yeah, I love that. And I think another thing that makes it so hard about emotional abuse, a friend of mine said this, there are no physical bruises with emotional abuse. And I thought it was powerful because what she was saying was there are internal bruises. And I thought
Mhm.
that was such an interesting perspective because it might not be outward, but you're still internally affected by it. And that makes it difficult to leave. So I'm wondering, you mentioned a little bit about self worth. Can you tell me how emotional abuse can damage a person's mental health or impact
Mhm.
them in some way like that?
Yeah. So there was a really good study on long-term effects of emotional abuse. And the thing that sort of popped up the most was this loss of identity. So
Mm.
people even feeling like their life, their body is not theirs anymore. You know, my partner does all of these things to me. They say all these things to me about my body and about who I am and my reason for being here. So it's not even mine anymore, it's theirs. And
Mm,
again, this can be a really sort of insidious, deeply entrenched thought or belief.
mm.
And so I would say that the loss of identity is one. I'd also say that self-esteem can be eroded through just constant, like, if someone is constantly making you feel like you're not enough and constantly making you feel like you need to aspire to be better in different ways, that can kind of erode your self-esteem too.
What would then a healthy relationship give you that maybe that doesn't have emotional abuse in it? You talked about a little bit of a loss of identity, self-esteem issues. In a healthy relationship, does that come up or what is present?
And so in a healthy relationship, it could come up just depending on what's happening in your life and depending on your own stuff. But typically in a healthy relationship, you feel secure and stable and safe. So you feel like you can talk to that person about difficulties that you're experiencing. You can expect forgiveness if there's been a wrong. And typically going back to the nervous system thing, that just feels different. You know, when you're with your partner, when your partner's in the room, when they walk into the house, it doesn't feel like such a jolt to your nervous system, but you feel this sense of safety and calm. And again, that's not to say that you may go through difficulties in your relationship that don't make you feel like that, or you might have these hits of your self-esteem due to sort of external factors, but a healthy relationship is supposed to make you feel sort of grounded in yourself and make you feel like there is room to grow and be better in a sort of healthy and supportive way.
It's very interesting what you say about grounded in yourself. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So feeling grounded in a relationship means feeling like, well, one, your reality is not being denied all the time. So
Right.
there's probably very minimal gaslighting, but
Mhm.
kind of feeling like you know that you and your partner are on the same page, you're working towards the same thing, and you yourself feel again safe and secure to make your own mistakes, to go your own path, to choose a different career path.
Mhm.
And you feel like you can have the freedom to sort of make healthy decisions, but be yourself and not feel like you have to change. I
Mhm.
think that sense of grounding in yourself, just again, in terms of your relationship with yourself, starts with self compassion and self forgiveness.
Mm.
Um, Knowing that you may not show up and be your best self every day, knowing that there might be lots of trauma and hurt, depression, anxiety, but knowing that you can take it a day at a time and
Mm.
sort of coming back to your body and coming back to doing things that make you feel rested and make you feel good about yourself really helps with that grounding feeling.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because I wonder, have you encountered anybody maybe throughout your life or your practice that is kind of using these tactics and kind of just does not recognize it for what it is? And then
Mhm.
are there ways in which you've been able to say, you're not making your partner feel like they can be who they are? And I'm
Mhm.
curious from the perspective of a person that is using abuse that maybe doesn't realize what they're doing. Have you ever had success in getting through to them, or what do you think could be successful in having a conversation with someone like that? Because, I've had a conversation with other coworkers about this where people feel very strongly that they do have this right to have their partner present in certain ways or
Mm,
act in certain ways. And
mhm.
how do you kind of navigate that in all different facets of life, really.
Mhm. So I'd say to answer the first question, there are people who I think do recognize that they're perpetrating or they're choosing to use emotional abuse, especially if those patterns are more overt, especially if they've gotten that feedback before. But there are also people that don't recognize it. And sometimes there's a very unconscious sort of thing going on. And we as human beings do a really good job of throwing all these defense mechanisms up to make things feel better. So
Yeah.
oftentimes the person who may choose to use abuse is defending against that. They're minimizing, they're rationalizing, and they're telling themselves stories
Mhm.
where they're like, no, I just care about my partner. So it may not even be a conscious thing. And I find, to answer sort of the second part of your question, it is easier to therapeutically work with people who may not even recognize that pattern, because it's just about sort of a direct confrontation in the context of a therapy relationship, at least a direct conversation about these patterns of behaviors and what they mean.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just providing psychoeducation to people
Yeah.
and letting them know that actually this is not really appropriate and their partner just is deserving of healthier dynamics. It kind of depends on that person's willingness to be confronted with what they might be doing. And it depends on the value of the therapeutic relationship and if they can be in a space where they can hear that feedback and then change. But I do think it's possible.
Yeah, definitely. And, our Jersey Center for Nonviolence has a lot of abuse intervention programs that work on that exactly. But it is interesting that you bring up minimizing, because I think that is a huge thing, particularly with emotional abuse, because it's someone could say, I'm not beating you. I'm not hitting you. So I'm not
Mhm.
abusing you. You think this is abuse, you should know what abuse really is. And I think that speaks to such an insidious nature of emotional abuse, because you almost feel constantly like almost not enough in a way to justify having an issue.
Exactly. And you know what I'd also add to that, speaking of like minimizing and not being able to recognize something for what it is, people who choose to use abuse typically have lots of shame, and
Yeah.
shame is such a complex emotion that really sort of comes from the way that we were treated as children from our caregivers too.
Mhm.
So oftentimes that sense of shame is so powerful that all there is left to do is do the minimization and do the deflection and do all the things that sort of push us away from what it really is.
Interesting. So it's like a lack, like almost like a difficulty accepting accountability, because then that would mean they had to fully acknowledge what they were doing. And that
Right.
could feel shameful. You know, I think that's such an interesting piece to this, because I think most people don't think of emotional abuse as bad as physical abuse. And that harms people, obviously, who are using the abuse, because then they're not reflecting and they're not really thinking, oh my gosh, I'm treating my partner poorly. And it also harms the people who are experiencing abuse, because then they maybe feel embarrassed to reach out. Or if they say, I'm experiencing abuse, and someone's like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that they ever touched you. And for them to have to say, well, it's more so emotional, I think there is a huge misunderstanding of just how damaging that is. So, what would you say to somebody who maybe feels embarrassed to reach out for help, because it is emotional, and that maybe other people have it worse, and this isn't for me or something?
I think what I'd say is, first, sort of going back to that self-compassion piece, I could understand if you haven't been in a healthy, loving relationship ever or for a really long time, I could understand why these behaviors have been hard to recognize. And I could also understand why it might feel hard to seek out help. You might feel like you don't even deserve to have a better
Mhm.
life, or you might feel like you have to stay with this person while you kind of fix the relationship, and you might feel like you have to heal the person that is choosing to use abuse. And so what I'd say is to seek help and to seek support. And really, I think it can be very helpful to talk with the people that we trust and people that we love about our experiences, because that can help normalize that a bit more. And if you're able to do it, seeking a professional who understands these dynamics and who can point them out to you while making you feel like this isn't your fault, while making you feel like there is help and there's hope on the way.
Yeah.
Um, So really just centering in that notion of compassion, and there is help and support that's out there for you.
Right, and not shaming somebody that's experiencing this. I'm curious, you really wanted to talk about emotional abuse and why it matters. So tell me a little bit about what drew you to this topic.
We don't do a good job as a society in providing some education about what emotional abuse is, even down to like the systemic things, even down to the legal system sort of having to catch up late and recognizing that abuse is not only physical.
Yeah.
So it's so hard for people to get access to the kind of information that would provide insight into what these dynamics are. To answer your question, I think what drew me to what made me want to talk about this is I've had and worked with a lot of clients who came to me like, oh, I have really debilitating anxiety, or, my doctor prescribed me an antidepressant or anti-anxiety and nothing's helping, nothing's working, and I just don't know what to do. I don't have any hope. And then once we really started to delve into their relational patterns and either their current relationship or past relationship or parent relationship, work relationship, what it really came down to is, oh my gosh, I was in a relationship where I felt so mistreated. And I was
Yes.
in a relationship where I constantly questioned my reality and my self-esteem was so little, and I just became smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that work is so rewarding because it takes away, this is something that I'm doing. This is something that's wrong with me too. And this is
Mhm.
something that was done to you. You didn't
Mhm.
choose to have this happen, and it's not your fault. And so it really helps people feel self-forgiveness and self-compassion. And I really think that we all deserve that.
There's something we learn about. I don't know the exact stat, but it was something like emotional abuse takes years to overcome because of
Mhm.
how much it affects somebody. And I think that that is something that we need to talk about more to get people to reflect on that, because otherwise I don't know how they would be able to get out of it.
There is so much power in naming and recognizing abuse for what it is when you're able to get to that point, when that information is provided to you, or when you're, seeking support from someone can be so powerful. And we all deserve the chance to start again and to start over and to really like begin to love ourselves. And so I just think that this work is so important.
Absolutely. And you spoke a little bit, you wanted to go into talking about why naming it is so important. So tell me a little bit more about that, just in general, about the importance of being able to kind of name it.
Yeah, I think that it's really empowering. And again, like I don't want to shame anyone into, it's tricky because I
Right.
think it's really hard to get to a place where you're able to name it, and we do have to acknowledge
100%.
that for people, right? But I think once you're able to recognize what's happening for what it is, it can be such an empowering position to be in, because that's when you could start to, if this is a safe option, set boundaries, and not even necessarily specifically with the person is choosing to use abuse, but in other aspects of your life.
Yeah.
That's where you can feel empowered to seek support. And so I think that starting from that place of naming it and recognizing it for what it is like the soil to the flowers that can grow from that.
Yeah.
I just think that that's really important.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an amazing point, which is that we can't shame anybody that isn't either ready or able to name it, and that you don't have to follow any one path. And this is something
Mm.
our crisis response team manager, Robin, always says is basically everyone is the expert in their own
Exactly.
experience. And I think that that is so powerful. And I remember, when I first started at JBWS, like I said, I didn't know a ton about abuse and I learned so much. And it really makes you reflect. But there was also coworkers would say, we can't tell people like they're being abused. That's
Mhm.
not for us to label someone as. And I thought that that was such a radical concept. Um, because you're seeing this, it's like, oh, but that's abuse. But also the person has to be ready to embrace that term and everything that comes with it.
Exactly, exactly. And if there's anyone listening who's supporting or loves someone who's experiencing emotional abuse, I think that that's a fantastic point, because
Mhm.
the best that we can do is meet someone where they're at and provide them a safe, compassionate relationship.
Yeah.
That's it. When a person may take a long time to kind of recognize and come to terms with what's happening. And again, like I said, there's a lot of empowerment that can come from that, but they also deserve love and respect and compassion while they're figuring that situation out.
Yeah, and also, do you think there's a reparative nature going on there where they are being met then with love and compassion by other relationships? So even if they aren't getting it in their romantic relationship or even their familial relationship, if you're being a supportive friend and you are showing them, proper boundaries and respect and concern, is that kind of reparative for them in a way?
I think so. I think so. I think that we call it kind of modeling, but I think you can model what a healthy relationship looks like with someone who's currently experiencing abuse. And
Mm,
again, like helping them sort of come to those terms themselves, not pushing them, not
right.
pressuring them. Those are probably dynamics that they're experiencing in that relationship anyway, but just meeting them where they're at and allowing them to contact you when they need support. So
Mhm.
really just kind of allowing that relationship to have set boundaries and to have love and compassion, but to accept them for where they're at right now is so important.
Yes, and modeling is it's a great point because, and this is another thing a coworker said to me is that we can't tell anyone what to do either because does that make us? That makes us in the same line as a person who's using abuse against them. That's still you're controlling them, but just from a perspective of like a positive perspective, but it's still control. And I
Mhm.
I thought that that was so revolutionary to me because I think people control people all the time. I mean, this is something after I started working here and I told my mom because my mom is very she has some health stuff and so I noticed I was super controlling with her health because I was like, "Oh, I know like you need to do this. Like you need to do this for your health." And it made me really reflect like, "Oh my God, like I'm not giving her any choice." And it
Mhm.
blew my mind, but I also think in these discussions, there's room for self-reflection of we're not perfect. We do these behaviors without even realizing it. And I,
Mhm.
I actually apologized to her and I was like, it's because I really care about you and I worry about you. But I realize that I'm being like very controlling. And
Mhm.
it was so eye-opening to me because I would never have wanted to think that. But
Mhm.
yeah, but I feel that if we are able to take a step back, we
Mhm.
can see sometimes that we are using these unhealthy behaviors. And I don't think necessarily it makes us a bad person, but we really do need to notice them and then try and change those behaviors.
Exactly. And the way that you handled that situation with your mom, I hope that people can hear that too and receive that. That's like being able to go to someone and say, I take accountability for how I contributed. I wasn't doing it to harm you. I wasn't even
Mhm.
necessarily doing it consciously and in
Yeah.
some ways, but I'm sorry for how that made you feel. And I'm sorry for doing that. And I love you. Let's start over is
Yes.
such a great way to kind of start that off after recognizing and sort of giving yourself grace for
Yeah.
even sort of doing that in the first place.
Yeah, and I think there's then obviously you can have a much more understanding relationship too, where it's not just forcing someone to do something, even outside of an abusive dynamic, just in general with control. And I think that is it was just such a powerful thing for me to recognize that there could be control even when you're not conscious that you're doing it. So I think that's another thing that's really kind of good about these conversations is that you can maybe start to recognize, oh man, like I'm not doing a great job in this area and I could do better. But that's the always like kind of the note is that you can do better. You can change and you can have these healthier, more supportive relationships, which I think is there's so much power in that. So inspiring.
Exactly. Exactly. You can do better and you can change the dynamics of the relationship and you can also give yourself grace at the same time. Like those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can all exist.
Duality.
Yeah.
Love it. Yeah. Do you have any closing words for people who are experiencing emotional abuse? Anything you want to leave people with?
Yes, first I'd say thanks for listening to us talk about this and thanks for kind of tuning in. I'd also say that the biggest thing that I hope you walk away from this conversation with is hope that I know I've said this a million times, but like there are people that love you, that want to support you. There is professional help, and counselors and therapists and psychologists like me do this because we care, and we care about giving you a space where you can just be you, and where we can meet you where you're at. And you do deserve to be loved in the way that makes you feel good. You do deserve a safe and secure and stable, healthy relationship. And if you're not in one right now, that's okay. That's not a reflection of who you are.
Mhm.
But I hope that you realize that there's hope to change it whenever you're ready.
Dr. Graddick, you are incredible. Thank you for making the time to speak with me about emotional abuse. I loved what you said about paying attention to your body and the sensations that you may experience around your partner. It's such a good barometer for how safe you feel in a relationship. If you're listening and you recognize that you may be in an emotionally abusive relationship, JBWS can help. You do not need to be experiencing physical violence to access our services. We are here to support people impacted by all forms of abuse. You are not alone. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.